Good afternoon. Welcome to the Department of the Interior Museum's Lunchtime Lecture Series. We offer lectures that focus on the Department of the Interior's various bureaus and the working that we do in each of those bureaus first Wednesday of the month. This week I'm very happy to be introducing Randall Orndorff. He is coming to us from the U.S. Geological Survey with a wealth of knowledge and really a long career with the U.S. Geological Survey. He worked as an intern first in 1981, but since has been working as a geologist specializing in the Appalachian and Ozark geology, geologic mapping, and karst, so caves and sinkholes, which we will be hearing about today. He has published 80 papers on geologic maps on subjects related to structural geology, stratigraphy, and karst. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dana. Great to be here. I'm out at Reston, so your USGS office in Reston, and do get down every once in a while to the department for meetings and things, and so I'm really happy to be here to be able to talk about something that I enjoy talking about, karst. I don't know how many people know the term karst. I think a lot of people do, but not all. So hopefully today when you leave, you'll know what karst is. Actually, you already do, but don't know it. The good definition of karst, it's basically a terrain. It's a type of topography that we get on top of rock areas that have rocks that dissolve, like limestone, gypsum, and even salt. And it's characterized by things like sinkholes and caves and large springs and underground drainage. And I think you all have seen that there's probably been a bit of news lately about sinkholes. So that's where the term, one part of the term karst. So I've got this wonderful chemical equation down here at the bottom, and usually when I start out with kids, I ask somebody, "Anybody want to explain that equation to me?" And they go, "No," and I'm like, "Okay, I'm not going to worry about it. I can't explain it either, so forget it." No. Basically, we have this. You add water to a system, mostly here in the humid East, and you actually create a very weak acid, what we call a carbonic acid. So as rainfall falls to the surface, and it's rainfall is already acidic. It's about pH of 5 or between 5 and 6 as it is. But as that rain gets into the ground and goes to the soil, it picks up carbon dioxide, and creates this acid. And when you get the acid, you get it into these soluble rocks like limestone, you start to dissolve the actual bedrock and create caves or voids in the system. So most people are familiar with like Carlsbad Caverns, Luray Caverns, and places like that. So it takes thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years to create these types of landscapes. When you think about groundwater, people talk about, well, aquifers, where we get our water from underground is generally, the aquifers are generally sand or hard bedrock, and the water is in the pores of the sand or in the fractures of the rock. And there's not really underground rivers. Well, for karst, you actually can get underground rivers. About 25% of the U.S. is underlain by some sort of karst or soluble rock. Areas like Florida, which we know very much about now, the Appalachians, running up from New York and down into Alabama, the Ozarks of Missouri and Arkansas, and places out western Texas, San Antonio area, and then various places in the basin and range. And this is important because of two things with karst. Is one, the hazard, sinkholes, and the other is water. And karst aquifers are actually a very important source of groundwater for folks throughout the U.S. And I think the number is about 40% of groundwater that's taken out for drinking water comes from what we call karst aquifers. Well, here's a typical landscape. This is an area out in Western Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, and you can see how that landscape is pretty flat. You can see a mountain of the Appalachians there in the background, and every once in a while you see a rock outcrop, and that's limestone. So the soil builds up on top of that limestone, and as it dissolves, as that rock dissolves and leaves the soil behind, it does it in a very wild way. So if you remove the soil, you get this. So basically you go from this, remove the soil to get to the rock, and this is actually kind of the moonscape you get. So quarries, before they go in to actually mine the limestone for aggregate, they need to remove the soil. And so you see these pinnacles of the rock. So it actually dissolves in very differential ways. I got back from taking this picture back in this trip in the late 90s, and I said, well, why in the world did I take a picture of a gravel road? Well, what that is actually a stream bed in the Ozarks of Missouri. You can see it's a humid environment. You have deciduous trees. They get about 40 inches of rain a year, and like we do around here, but there's no water in the stream. Because of all those voids and all those caves underneath the ground, the water is actually going underground as opposed to in the stream bed. What it does in this area of Missouri, it takes anywhere from 3 to 7 inches of rain in a very short period of time to actually get any water running down these streams. So the thing about a karst area is underground drainage. Most of the water goes underground and is drained that way through the cave systems and not on the surface. Okay, let's talk about sinkholes, something that's been in the news quite a bit lately, right? This is an area in southwestern Virginia, and a sinkhole is basically a depression on the surface, so all the way around. So basically it's internally drained. Kind of looks like divots on a golf ball, doesn't it? So these generally happen over, say, long periods of time as the soil creeps into the voids underground. And then we have these types that are just these kind of catastrophic collapses. And these are the ones that make the news. This one, again, is in the Ozark of Missouri. And this is an interesting thing. I got this call from this gentleman who had this large farm, and he says, hey, I got this problem. You got to come out and see this hole I have. What had happened is he woke up one day, and he was checking out his fence line, and he noticed one of his trees was gone. He had this really important called blackjack oak in Missouri. So he calls up his neighbor and starts yelling at the guy. It's like, why'd you cut down my tree? And the guy said, what are you talking about? He said, that was a great tree. You cut down my blackjack oak. He says, no, I didn't. And so they met out in the field. That's the top of the blackjack oak right there. That tree was 60 feet high. So you can see how big that hole was. So you have a void underneath, and it just dropped out. So sinkholes happen basically two ways. This is the way I like to kind of do it simply. The bottom, let's talk about the bottom, what we call the cover subsidence sinkholes. So kind of that first picture I showed that looked like the golf ball divots. So you've got a soil that's over top of the limestone bedrock, and then you have a cave system, the voids underground. That's the thing about all sinkholes, is you have to have a void to be able to take the material from the surface to create the sinkhole. So the soil, in a sandy soil, for instance, the soil will just creep down into the hole, and over time you start getting this depression on the ground, and it just gets deeper and deeper as more soil goes to fill out that cave in the void. Now, the ones that make the news and the ones that we're most concerned about are what we call cover collapse sinkholes. Same situation, you got a cave, you have a soil, but in most limestone areas, the soil is actually clay. And clay holds together quite well. Played with clay, how sticky it is. So as that void, as that material starts going down into that cave system, the void actually occurs below the surface, and you don't see an expression on the surface. And that void is almost like a bubble. More soil goes down into that hole, the more that void heads toward the surface to a point where it can no longer hold itself, and then boom, you have a collapse, and it collapses into the void. Now, people ask, since the Florida situation back a few weeks ago, is there a sinkhole season? And the question is, well, I don't think you could call it a sinkhole season, but yes, there is a connection between weather and when we get sinkholes, a lot of the cases. So, for instance, we see a lot of sinkholes occur after very large precipitation events. So, if you think about it, if you got this situation right here, and you add water, a lot of water, very rapidly to that system, you know how heavy water is? So basically, you've got a certain amount of weight on top of this bridge. You add that much weight with the water, and you get collapses. Another is droughts. So the opposite situation. A lot of times with droughts, you're going to drop the water table. If the water table's up here somewhere, you're okay. But if you start dropping that water table down here, it's almost like flushing a toilet. You've all that buoyancy you have is now gone. And another thing about clay is it holds water very well. And, clay is cohesive. It really, binds things together. You ever take a drop of water and put it on the table and lift your finger up, right? It kind of sticks to your finger a little bit. It's almost like a glue to it. If you dry out the clay, that also tends to help the system collapse. We have a joke with the geologists that most of the time you find a sinkhole, you're going to find a tire in it, right? Or cows. Find a lot of cows around sinkholes. Well, and it does kind of make sense because most sinkholes, a lot of the areas, limestone areas of the country are agricultural areas. So you have lots of agriculture, a lot of cows around there anyway. But then there are the ones that tend to happen in other places. This was a very famous one back in the 1980s in Winter Park, Florida. That took out, you can see, basically a city block. Part of that was this is what they call Winter Park, the Winter Park sinkhole. There was actually a Porsche dealership. I think they lost 5 cars down the hole, and fish. I think they actually got them out, but so this one you actually lost some pretty expensive automobiles. As you see here, a couple drill rigs in down the hole. These both are in Florida. This one's actually here in Virginia, and there is a link to these. You think about, other ways, how can human influence affect sinkholes and make it more rapid? In this case, if you're drilling into the ground and pulling water out, and you start pulling that mud, to make that void, you're making that system happen a lot faster. So people have to be very concerned when they drill water wells that they don't actually pull not only the water, but the material underground to actually exasperate the situation. Highways. What happens a lot is, in a karst area, well, most areas, in the natural environment, the rain hits the surface and it percolates down through the soils, right, into the ground. So, but if we sit there and we pave the roads or we put up buildings and things, that's an impervious surface. Water can no longer just soak into the ground like it normally did. Now it runs off of these surfaces into ditches, down into gutters, and we concentrate all that water into the subsurface. And that tends to wash out a lot of the soil and things. And a lot of times on highways, you get collapses like this. I talked with a gentleman who did a lot of road repair for Virginia Department of Transportation. The Interstate 81 corridor between Stanton, Virginia and the West Virginia line, they repair, on average, a dozen sinkholes a year. And he said, you add all the other roads in that area, and it's dozens and dozens a year. Most of them we don't know about, we don't hear about. Every once in a while, people do drive into them. This is kind of an interesting, everybody know where Berryville is? Berryville, Virginia? Okay, out western Virginia. Back in the late 90s, we got called on this one. Gentleman, one Saturday morning, drinking his coffee, reading his paper, hears this horrible noise in his basement. He opens up his basement door just in time to watch his furnace go down the hole. Got out of the house. Within a matter of a couple hours, the whole entire part of the house was in the hole, although the outside of the house still looked fine, kind of like the one in Florida. However, just a week later, you had the house pretty much gone. You still got the front steps and the, looks like the mud room there. But within a month, this was what the house looked like. And that's the roof. Again, this was probably about a 45, 50-foot deep sinkhole. The interesting thing here, let's go back to that drill rig, is, how can you prove why this sinkhole happened? Well, it gets pretty touchy. It's a natural environment, but at the same time, things are going on. Just a few days before this happened, they were drilling a well in the front yard of this house. The well driller was drilling away, and all of a sudden just started sucking up mud. So we abandoned it. So all I'm getting is mud. So I said, what have you done? It's flushed out all the soil that was underneath, basically a cave that was underneath this house, and basically exasperated the situation. But if you look around, you see any other houses? This is not a neighborhood. This house was like the only house within a mile. There was a farm across the street. And you're thinking, you talk about bad luck. You got acres and hundreds of acres surrounding, and the hole happened underneath the house. But as geologists, we looked at that area, and there was a line of 20 sinkholes, previous sinkholes, and this house sat right on the line. You could draw a line, straight line across 20 sinkholes, and that house sat right in the middle of them. Infrastructure. Obviously, we already saw the road situation. Here, this is a bridge in Pennsylvania, southern Pennsylvania. The sinkhole actually happened here. You can see how the bridge has broken down. And if you think about it, people talk about, well, maybe we shouldn't be living on karst. Maybe we shouldn't be living in areas that are prone to sinkholes and things like that. But when you have a country that has as much, karst terrain as we do, you really can't avoid it. And if you think about it, we got cities like St. Louis and Lexington, Cincinnati, Nashville, of course, most of Florida. And it's all about being smart. It's about engineering. It's about understanding the situation. That's where the science comes to play. If we can understand the system, then we can learn how best to live with it and live on it if we can. But we definitely have to take certain precautions, and you want to protect the system as much as you can. Another aspect about sinkholes is environment. Here's a map of an area of Missouri. All the black dots are sinkholes. You think, okay, well, that's not too bad. But the fact is that these sinkholes are natural inputs to the groundwater, and very rapidly. So, but if you look at the drainage basin around those sinkholes, all of this area, for this one right here, there's a road that runs right straight through there. If you had like a tractor trailer truck with some kind of hazardous chemical spill here, it would drain right into this big sinkhole, and it would immediately end up in your drinking water. So you have to be cognizant of the situation of how rapidly we can get things into the groundwater system with hazardous materials. Some would also say the corollary to that is it can also rapidly get out of the system. Some things can, not all things. All right, let's move to springs. Springs are a large part of a karst area. As the water flows through the caves, almost like natural river systems, invariably they come back to the surface. If I like this picture here, this is outside of Winchester, what they call Spangler Spring. See the old house here? If you go out in the Shenandoah Valley, you can usually find the springs when you find those late 1700 houses. People would build, these were water sources, in some cases still are. Springs come in different ways. Here's this big cliff, and here you got a stream, this cave stream coming out. This is one of the I would say probably the largest single conduit spring in the country. Florida has probably the largest number and the largest production of springs. But this one, believe it or not, they call it Big Spring in Missouri. 287 million gallons of water a day. A lot of water. That's basically an instant river. Here's the spring here. You see it boiling up, and this is what they call the rise pool area, and it's basically an instant river. Here it is. You can see it actually boiling up. Here's the entrance area. It comes out with such force, 13 cubic meters a second. It's a huge amount of water coming out. This one is aptly named Blue Spring. As you can see, nice blue water coming out. So it's the same situation as the last one, but just not as much water coming out. And people, yes, are crazy enough to go into springs. We have cavers that do caving. And, well, some people actually like to get into the springs and actually do underwater caving. I'm not one of them. I don't know, anybody else in the room? Anybody been down in it to do this? I guess people can die in different ways. I'm not going that way. But you can see this is one of the cave systems in Florida. And I mean, look how clear that water is. I mean, just beautiful blue. We call it a spring system. They'll go down, of course, they have to stage their bottles, so they have to have certain air mixtures and stuff. We actually wanted to understand the geology and the whole karst system in the Ozarks that we were working on. We wanted to know more about those cave systems. We could get into the dry caves. I'll go into the dry caves, but I'm not going into the ones that are active today. And these guys would. So we actually had a partnership with the Ozark Cave Diving Alliance. And these guys would, here, this is a rise pool of one that's only producing 81 million gallons a day. So obviously a lot less, but they would dive into this rise pool and give us, be able to bring us back rock samples. We actually found out there was a geologic control. And this is what we're studying, is what is the geologic control on these karst spring sinkhole cave systems. And they gave us a nice map, and you can see here's the rise pool. And once you go down into the cave, it just kind of goes up and down. It's pretty much just goes along. But we found out it actually goes underneath of a certain rock unit that really played an important role. So these maps that we were able to get from these spring caves were very helpful in us understanding the system. So let's talk about caves. The ones I'll go in. So the thing about a cave is that basically, a cave is the temperature in a cave is fairly constant. You go to like Luray Caverns, or they always tell you, oh, the temperature is about 57 degrees or whatever. That is actually a good proxy for what the average temperature of an area is. It's a good climate indicator. So in Virginia, the average, cave is about 56 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you take your highs and your lows, all year long, that's what you're going to get. I met some guys from Croatia who had been to Iran, and their caves were 80 degrees. They were caving in shorts. They were sweating a lot. I got to go in some caves in Slovenia, and they were 45 degrees. That was quite cold. It was quite a shock to be in those caves. So caves can tell us a lot. Caves can be different sizes. They can be small one like this. This one, you go in that hole, it gets no bigger than that for about 350, 400 feet. So you crawl through that little passage for a long way, and yet you have other caves in the same area that are the size you could drive a Mack truck through. So caves come in various sizes, various shapes. This one I went to in Slovenia, that's a bridge. Those are people standing on the bridge. And there's a passage just over here on the left. And when you go into this cave system, anybody been to Slovenia, in the Slovenian caves? This is Pistonia at Pistona. And it's almost like the Ray Caverns. You go into this cave. Have you been in this cave? No, and there's something. So you walk down, just like a regular cave tour. Then they walk you up to this fence. Lights are off, and you stand there, and they turn the lights off, and it's like this huge canyon. I mean, those blocks down there are the size of tractors on tractor trailers. See this right here? That's actually a pathway. And those pathways, these are like sheer walls. And so back in the 1800s, after they had discovered these caves, people went in. It's basically a sheer wall. Well, how are you gonna get a trail there? They would actually dig into the mountain or into the side of the cave, and then put a notch so you'd have a place to walk like that. And that's a lot of blackness, let me tell you. Now this part, they actually had a little handrail. I didn't trust it. But it's just a spectacular cave system. And actually, Slovenia is what we call the home of karst. The name karst comes from Kras, K-R-A-S, which was an area in this part of Europe, which is now Slovenia or former Yugoslavia. Something about caves. Deepest cave that we know right now is in the country of Georgia. It's about 1.3 miles deep. So what they say, 60% of average, that's a deep cave. Everybody, I think, understands that Mammoth Cave is the longest cave system. It wasn't for a long time until people actually started making connections. There's something called the Cave Research Foundation that got together many decades ago, and their job was to go in and map Mammoth Cave area, and they really put a lot of them together. So we're now at over 500 miles surveyed in Mammoth Cave. The largest chamber was this deer cave in Borneo. I got some great stories about that one. That's for another time. But now this mountain river cave in Vietnam is now considered the largest chamber. Basically, they could fit like a 740, easily fit a 747 into a chamber. And what they think is the oldest cave now is in Australia, which is 340 million years old, they believe. But my question is how do you date a hole? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Like I said, caves come in different sizes. Well, how did I get interested in caves? This is me entering Orndorff Cave. I actually grew up on a farm with a cave, and got me interested when I was a little kid. Teenager, I guess. My grandfather would always say, "Don't you go in that cave." I mean, he talked about stories. This cave goes to the Lost River, and it goes for miles and everywhere and everything. And he kept saying, "You don't go in that cave." Well, as teenagers, what do? You go in the cave. So my buddy and my cousin and I went in the cave, and my cousin went first, and my friend and I was last. And the cave went as far as went a little ways. I never got to the end because it was such a tight passage. So years later, I said, I've never been to the end of my own cave. So I got my caving gear and my partner, and we decided we were going to go down into Orndorff Cave. I'm going to go to the end of my cave. So the cave goes down about 30 degrees, probably about as high as the ceiling here. And then you get down into a passage, which is only about shoulder's width, and a crawl. and you crawl for about 6 or 7 feet, and then the cave bends to the left. So I did the bend to the left, and I came face to face with this raccoon. And so my caving partner is on the surface. He said, "Man, I heard that raccoon go, oh, wow." And it took me 30 minutes to get in the cave. It took me 30 seconds to get out. But I've been into well over 100 caves around the world, and I've never been to the end of my own cave. Something happened because I used to be able to get in that cave, but that cave, it got smaller. The cave opening definitely got smaller. Caves, so here's a typical cave passage. I really like to, people like a lot of pretty stuff in the caves and the stalactites and stalagmites, but I like to look at the morphology because basically you can see the different rock layers and how they affect how the cave formed. In this case, kind of dark to see here, but you can see this nice rock ceiling and mud floor here. Well, there's actually a fracture that runs across here, something we call a bedding plane. Rocks are layered. Sedimentary rocks are layered and limestone's layered. So that bedding plane is a very important feature we found out that really drove the development of caves, at least in the Ozarks. So here's a cave, right? And here's the top part. So basically, if you can imagine, these are basically like two pipelines. These are basically natural pipelines of water that were moving from one place. Water is always trying to get from a higher elevation to a lower elevation, driven by gravity, just like a river. In this case, it's basically like a pipeline, natural pipeline. But then there are the stalactites and stalagmites and the things that grow from the ceilings and the floors. Sometimes you see interesting morphologies. These are what we call scallops. So as the water is rushing through these, old natural pipelines, they'll erode with little eddies on the ceilings and the floors. And you can actually measure the distances between the crests of these various what we call scallops and run equations and figure out what the velocity of the water was running through some of these cave passages. I want to come out kind of dark. This is what we call a cave shield. It's hard to see because this is in 2 dimensions, but this is the ceiling, and you see some stalactites there. And then there's this empty space, and then you have this thing here with all these flow stones coming off it, we call a shield. I don't think anybody really knows exactly how these things form. They're kind of like sitting out there. I mean, they're anchored down here to the rock, but how did that form like that? Grand Caverns is probably the best place you're going to see it in the country, just Grand Caverns, Virginia. Some more I think this is from Endless Caverns out in the Shenandoah Valley. All right, you got stalactites and stalagmites. They come up, and after many thousands and thousands of years, they come together, and you get what we call these columns. Some more of this round spring. These, unfortunately, I have nothing for scale because I didn't want to get too close to them, but these things are probably twice the size of me, round-wise. But generally, basically, you have water that's super saturated with calcium carbonate. And so it's in the water system. It starts to drip out, and as it hits the air or it gets agitated, the mineral will remineralize. The calcium carbonate will remineralize as either a stalactite or a stalagmite. And the cool thing is we can actually date the carbon that's in these things. So these were 2 speleothems, what we call speleothems. In this case, we take the stalagmites, and you can see it's almost like tree rings. Can you see the little rings here? So that's how it's built. So as the water would drip, drop by drop, it would leave its calcium carbonate behind and would build these things. And you can see with this one, it was anywhere from 66,000 years old to about 12,000 years old. And this one here, we've been able to date to 116,000 years old. So, we can have an idea. Remember I was talking about how you date a hole? Well, at least we can date things that are in that hole. So we know that the cave has got to be older than 116,000 years. And obviously to do the work, I said the mapping the cave, to actually get in the caves and make maps of the caves, really tells us a lot about that cave system. You got to put yourself in some pretty crazy, tight, muddy places. But we can actually look at these caves, look at some various measurements to understand these orientations of these passages actually tell us something about how the cave formed. And you say, well, why would that be important? Who cares that this cave has this kind of development? Well, if we can understand what that pipeline of water was in the past, maybe we can have a good understanding of how the groundwater is moving today. And if we can understand that, we can manage our water resources that we're pulling out of the ground in these areas. So you find every little tight little hole you can, stick yourself in to make sure you get a good map, and you tend to end up looking like this. I came home from one of the trips, looking like this, and I take my cave clothes out, I threw it out in the yard, and got my hose and my brush and bleach and everything, and I'm scrubbing away. And my neighbor walks by, and she starts shaking her head. And I said, "What?" She goes, "I'm glad my husband's an accountant." So, things that live in caves. There are things that live closer to the edge of the caves or to the openings that may actually have, you can actually see they kind of camouflage themselves in as these various types of lizards. And then there's others, Proteus and various lizards, but you notice they don't have the pigment. This is what they call, this one has, you can see some remnants of some eyes in this cave lizard, but basically they're living in the pure darkness. They don't need eyes to see. They have other senses they're using to find their food and to get around. And obviously without any sunlight, there's no reason to have much in the way of pigment. Here's some cave fish. And this one's completely lost any idea of having any kind of eyes. And here's a cave crawfish. Again, no pigment. When we were kind of surprised to see when we had those cave divers in the Ozarks going in those springs, that they would go in almost a mile and find these things, and just so deep into the cave system that there's that much food to be had. The other thing are bats. So here's a colony like this. There's obviously many species of bats, and we got somebody here that knows something about bats. This species here, they tend to congregate together as one big mob as they hibernate. And but I guess a lot of people have heard about what's happening here in the last, I don't know how many years has it been since 2000, so 2007 was the first report of what we call white nose syndrome. So they were finding in New York, up in the New York, Vermont area, in some of the caves and mines up there, that the bats were out flying around in January. That's generally their hibernation time. There's not much for them to eat. They were seen, I don't know, hibernating, but at least sleeping close to the cave entrance where it was still cold. And people were noticing this. This one here doesn't seem to have much, but you can see the little white fuzz or fungus around the nose of the bats, what they call white nose. That's why the term white nose syndrome. And still being studied today. It's I think I took the map out, but basically, if you go back to that karst map that shows the area, we could actually see it spread from New York down to Virginia in 3 years, I think. By the time I hit Virginia, about 2010, I think, when we first saw it in Virginia, maybe 2009. And then also, so people were going in doing bat counts and noticing the bat populations decreasing greatly, and also noticing the bats flying around in crazy times of the year. And so as years went on, we kept finding it further and further away from New York. All of a sudden, I got a call one day, and they were finding it in a cave in Wisconsin. Well, if you think about it, New York, there's the limestone area in New York. Well, it goes up into Canada, around Ontario, and then wraps around Michigan Basin, and then back into the U.S. and around Wisconsin. And now it's as far west as Oklahoma. And so for the longest time, a lot of the public caves have been closed to a moratorium for many years. And what's your name again? Sally, yeah. And Sally worked at BLM. Was telling me she works on the white nose syndrome, is that some of the caves are now being opened. Again, as cavers, we go in, we try to, it's a fungus that we're finding in the soils in the caves. So if you're in a cave that's got it and you're carrying that soil with you, you go to another cave, you could be taking the disease and spreading that disease. So the idea of the vector of how the disease is actually spreading, or the fungus is spreading, I haven't heard a whole lot more about it, but we're trying to figure out, is it because of the people going from cave to cave, or is there a bat-to-bat connection? Some species are more prone to it than others. I think the Virginia long-eared bat doesn't seem to be affected where a lot of the other species are. So, the environment, obviously environment in caves and things is very important. So let me end with, this is a natural picture inside of a cave at night. Thank you.